Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 30th of September, and in today's concise update, we're looking at a Russian entrance into Poltavka, which is a village on the Yancho River line. We'll then look at advances on the eastern flank of the Kazneyi Torets River. Then looking at the Siversk direction, the Russians are advancing to the north of the village in the Rudnik district and in Vyimka to the south. We'll then look at the Lyman direction with the capture of Chandrikholove and parts of Zaporizhzhia. And to finish off, we're looking at updates from Kupyansk. There's a lot of fluidity, and so I've refrained from titling the video anything related to Kupyansk until we get final confirmation of what's been alleged by many Russian sources. But as we get into this video, please like, share, subscribe, anything to boost us in the algorithm. Here you guys can see that the Russians have been able to enter into Poltavka. There is a polygon over here amounting to 1.92 square kilometers worth of territory. Since the previous update, the Russians have been able to push 1.5 kilometers westwards, and in the process, they've been able to enter into the first houses and warehouses in the eastern chunk of the village. On September 30th, video was released on Facebook by the 20th Army Corps, wherein they claim to have thwarted an attempted storming of the village. So they detected, using aerial reconnaissance, Russian squads that really were able to traverse open fields in areas that are rather exposed, but they gathered around Olhivska initially and pushed about 3 kilometers southwestwards. From there, they started to seep into the local dugouts and first houses and were targeted by Ukrainian drone crews with grenade drops. And they claim to have picked off all those individual Russian soldiers. We saw at least 2 of them picked off in the video. You can see how there are defenses on the northeastern perimeter of the town, but they are relatively thin and there simply isn't enough depth. So once the Russians are able to overrun some of these defenses, as we've already seen over here, many are already in Russian hands or are in a gray zone. And you just perceive the situation over here. You can understand that it's impossible essentially for the Ukrainians to man any sort of defensive campaign with infantry out in the open defending in this defensive line to the east of the river, because it is so exposed to Russian aerial bombardment at this point in time. So the Ukrainian forces that are actually holding out, they're doing so within Poltavka itself. They're trying to resist in individual houses or along the roads. And then you have drone crews that may also be deployed in Poltavka, or perhaps to the west in areas like Novouspanivsk or Nove, and they're the ones that are engaged in the strikes targeting the advancing Russian forces. So that's a word on Poltavka, but now the eastern side of the river is certainly exposed because it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to move back and forth. The Russians already have been able to gain a foothold, meaning they have a steady line of communication from Olhivska. You can see Olhivska over here on the map, and then there's this paved route. You have to take this right turn and from there arrive at Poltavka. And so, yes, there certainly is now the infrastructure in place needed to allow the Russians to complete the storming of the village. You can see how the salient is formed in the southeast of Poltavka in this excess open field territory where there may be a couple of Ukrainian squads that continue to resist in tree lines that run vertically. But most of the Russian attack vectors are focused on this direct entrance from the east and also on some pressure from Alanivka. So then you have the Ukrainians over here in the salient that sort of fell through the cracks, but naturally their control over there will also dissipate. And same thing would go for this area north of the Yancho River, these open fields in the areas that I'm marking with red over here as well, additional excess territory. Because Poltavka is slightly larger, it is going to be a major loss if the Russians can take it over, because it would serve as a forward operating node larger than any other nearby, of course with the exception of Alanivka, but from the eastern direction, meaning the areas that the Russians are currently attacking from with, say, the 60th Motor Rifle Brigade, and there are a couple of other ones over here that are of particular note. But they're organizing and then dispatching their assault squads from really small villages like the Vodny, Stepove, etc. Poltavka is a different story, and it also runs along the same paved road and along the same river valley towards other areas like Novomykolaivka, Novovasilievsk, etc. When it comes to the significance on a slightly larger level, you look at the river line, and there actually are some trenches that were built along the northern bend of the river that aren't necessarily shown on satellite imagery, but they are present. Certainly not enough. They're definitely not going to be enough to absorb an assault once the Russians arrive over there, but they should be noted. The problem is, past this line, you have this massive gap, and you can see it over here on the map, in between the first and second lines of defense meant to protect Zaporizhzhia, then spill into Dnipro Oblast. So this opening in this major corridor, not only does it lack any static defenses, any sort of major obstacles built by the Ukrainians, but there aren't many villages either. You have a 10-kilometer corridor at its narrowest points. In other locations, it's even wider. And you only have Solotkin and Rivnopilia, two villages that are not on the Yancho River line. So this is certainly a concern for the Ukrainians, and that's why they are taking some preemptive measures to prevent this. Certainly not anything when it comes to sending in sappers and engineers now to build it up, because at this point it's way too difficult, both from the south, because that's where you're going to have most of the aerial pressure coming in from, but perhaps also from the east at this point as the Russians are closing in. But my point is, there's a concerted effort now by the Russian side to expand their footprint from Novy Vyimka all the way into Novovasilivsk. And so far, you've had one battalion from the 154th Mechanized Brigade, the 110th Mechanized Brigade, the two of them with their individual battalions coming together to prevent that from occurring. And so they're concentrating a large grouping of Ukrainian forces in this narrow region amounting to 2.2 kilometers between the Yancho River line and the contact line. So that's why the Russian side that captured Novoivановka has been unable to expand their footprint to a sufficient degree to the southwest just yet. But they've been able to take over numerous open fields in the process. And the unit that is involved most in this assault would be the 394th Motor Rifle Regiment. And in the process, because we know that the Russians attacked from Ohivska westwards with the intention of cutting off the river and putting some pressure onto the hamlet Ohodnishny. We also know that there's a push from Novoivановka southwards. So again, an excess sort of bulge salient to the east of the river valley has formed, and small Ukrainian squads, we're talking about just individual groupings of 1, 2, 3, 4 that are holding out in some of these tree lines and near the floodplains. They are the only reason why there has not been a correction. But once there is, it's going to provide a much larger surface area for a Russian assault on this line, which is already, really difficult to defend because it lacks any sort of depth, and the Ukrainians are fighting with their backs behind towards the body of water. Yes, it is narrow, but regardless, they don't have anywhere else to withdraw towards besides abandoning the line completely as we get closer. And that's why the Ukrainians are deploying a lot of their forces and trying to accumulate them up in this one particular corridor when there are so many other locations that certainly need reinforcements. But it appears as if there is some sort of priority on this X or square area that I marked a moment ago. In Novohorivka, there's also a mass deployment of Ukrainian forces from the 154th Mechanized Brigade. They are trying to prevent the nightmare scenario wherein the Russians can take it over and then use it as a linchpin to attack towards other villages along the northern parts of the river valley, like Uspanivka and such. So that's why they've not been able to take it over yet, the Russians. But, there are clashes going on the eastern outskirts of the village. So certainly keep an eye for it. And to the south of Kalinivsk, the Russians understand now that they have been able to secure the initiative, advance along a narrow path from Kalinivsk all the way to Verbove. They want to retain control and consolidate those advances and then expand further westwards in this case. But that can only be done with the support from the flanks. And so there are efforts underway to take over Stepove and nearby tree lines, but that's not been finalized. And to the south, there is this protruding Ukrainian node of defense, and you have this sort of ravine extending out of the border region between Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia. So there is a Ukrainian garrison holding out over there. The Russian intention is to clear them out, and they've already initiated that process by taking over what amounts to 3.37 square kilometers worth of territory. Pushing westwards, it's about 1.2 kilometers. So that is important to note, but you do still have this entire protruding area over here that I'm marking in between the border region with the Zaporizhzhia and the Russian penetration point along this paved road. And so this is an area that will be subject to a lot of Russian assaults in the near future. And due to the fact that, again, you don't have many defenses in this region, you, of course, have the defenses to the north that are defending the Verbova line and all of the other villages that run along that same road. But to the south, you have this massive gap that, again, can be exposed and can be utilized to arrive at other portions of the Yanchor River network. So from Privilia southwards, all the way to this village over here, Privilny, and that entire sector over here that I'm going to measure, it's about 9 kilometers, and it's just completely exposed right now. Not to mention the fact that the areas even further south have their own issues relating to, potential frontal attacks or suffering some sort of isolation from the flanks. Like, all of that is legitimate over there, but the same things will eventually happen to the regions between Privilia and Privilny. They just haven't yet because you have a lot of these fluffy areas. There's a lot of fluff and excess fields that the Ukrainians are holding on to by the skin of their teeth simply by sending in, these undermanned battalions, and their forward operating forces are the ones holding out in some of these tree lines over here that have to be cleared out. The Russians are initially bypassing, and then only afterwards, once they achieve some sort of narrow penetration, like the one of Borove, then they sort of focus inwards and try to remove any Ukrainian positions that may be a thorn in their back later on. Now to zoom in over here, you could see a very similar trend with this extremely deep protruding salient. It's about 6 kilometers to the east of what you would assume to be the normal straight front line. And so the Russians are pushing from Berezhove and Ternove, and they captured 3.1 square kilometers of territory. And there is an attempt now to unify between the garrison and these two villages, and of course the network that took over Sosnivka and Khoroshi. To be honest, in this area, the Ukrainians have been able to turn the ship. Now, there are some reports from Ukrainian sources of special forces in the past couple of days that were able to re-enter Secheneve. I don't know if that's true, but it is certainly the case that the Ukrainians have redeployed some forces to this area. There's been a large emphasis on some of the Marine units recently, and then also the 31st Mechanized Brigade, and some support from the 110th Brigade as well, although they were moved a bit to the south now. And that is what allowed the Ukrainians to first of all hold on to Alexandrorod. It's still under their control to my knowledge, and stabilize the front line along the Vovcha River, taking advantage of the natural barrier, and then also, of course, the forested patches that make it very difficult for any opposing force to cross over and gain a sustainable breachhead. And due to the fact that there is so much proximity to Veliki Komykhalivka, it's going to be very difficult, and it has been now for a couple of weeks, for the Russians to continue expanding towards this node of defense for the Ukrainians, because it serves as a great center of gravity for their defense. So they have a lot of forces deployed over here that can very easily be dispatched to the line of contact and halt any offensive activity. And that's why both the Ukrainians put an emphasis on holding out over here and succeeded. And then also the Russians, on the flip side, understood that it was not necessarily beneficial to attack over here. They wouldn't really be, abetting any of their major objectives by crossing over the river and focusing northwards. And so that's why they've shifted their offensive component southwards. And they've been able to continue with steady progress every single day now. But let's move on and zoom in on the situation to the east of the Kazneyi Torets River, an area that we've been talking about a lot. And I've been, yet again, of course, warning about the potential danger to the Ukrainians here. Because, yes, it was really important from a Ukrainian perspective to hold out in this river line, and it's something they succeeded in doing during early August when there were fears that they would eventually have to abandon it. And the fact that they were able to hold on eventually gave them a platform to not fully cut off the Kucherevia pockets, but put immense strain on it, find certain gaps that could be used to undermine the supply lines into the pockets. And it serves as a great forward position for drone crews to be stationed in, for mortars to be brought in to fire towards any sort of outstretched Russian position, and then also just serving as a stalwarts that puts a lot of pressure onto the Russians from all the way from the western bank of the Kazneyi Torets River, where you have Boykivka and Novotoretsk, which again was under immense pressure from Volodymyrivka over the past week. So from that location, and then measuring upwards 14 kilometers, there's simply a lack of freedom of operation. There's no freedom of operation for the Russians over here due to the fact that there is this projection coming in from a very strong Ukrainian garrison, including Skala, including 225th Regiment, including 31st Mechanized Brigade, and the list really goes on over here. There's so many units, including air assault forces, and having them in this compact area, it makes it a formidable, pressure points for the Ukrainians against the Russian cauldron over here. That's why they've been so insistent on holding on to it. But the Russians, at the same time, they've been tacitly changing this arrangement by advancing on the eastern flank and not necessarily receiving the most resistance. They've been able to push the Ukrainians out of Rusyn Yar entirely, and north of Poltavka, they're pushing and have been able to push in recent weeks about 7.5 kilometers north, reaching this major pond region. There are a couple of ponds and reservoirs that are running along here. Perhaps they're not reservoirs, but these large bodies of water, and adjacent to them you have these large tree lines and ravines as well. So those are just falling into Russian hands now. You can see how south of this pond, about 4.82 square kilometers of territory was captured, and measuring northwards, it's about 2.8 kilometers just in the past day. This video is from September 28th. It's a video from the 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, one of the main Ukrainian units involved in the defensive efforts in this region. And they conducted grenade drops. They also dropped mines. They conducted FPV strikes onto the tree lines and dugouts over here, as the Russians were in the process of dislodging them and turning them into their own forward operating posts. And so now the process is already underway for the Russians to clear out everything south of this body of water, to clear out all of the nearby ravines and get control over the heights that overlook Sofivka, Shakhove, Volodymyrivka. And at that point, first of all, the casualties will increase, the logistics in and out of the pockets, in and out of the river line will be even further strained, and then the necessary platform will have been sort of produced in order for the Russians to begin assaulting this entire river line. And from there, they can easily be squeezed out because it is a very narrow river line, despite the fact that there is a lot of Ukrainian, defensive density in terms of troops deployed. At the same time, though, this also creates difficulties for the trench networks built north of Rusyn Yar, because now the Russians have an organization point in Rusyn Yar itself, and they have this sort of western flank that can be used to sort of serve as a hook to push in from another direction and thereby squeeze the Ukrainians out. And the Ukrainians being from the 111th TDF Brigade and the 44th Mechanized Brigade, maybe even the 93rd Mechanized Brigade at this point, which has recently been pushed further and further westwards from its original position in Yablonivka. So that entire Ukrainian force will also be under some pressure, and that's a part of the entire sort of large-scale movement we always theorized about in the direction of Druskivka and Konstantinivka and all that. But right now, what's more pertinent and what we're seeing that could affect the battlefield in the here and now is this Russian continued advance to the east of Torets. And there are some initial reports, not confirmed, that Russian DRGs are already cutting off the road and entering into the eastern parts of Sofivka. Now, even if that's not true, I would expect them to do this now because they have a paved road that directly leads into this village. And it is a bit further to the east. It's smaller in size, so it could be a good target to just sort of storm and undermine the entire, sort of underpinnings of Ukraine's cauldron in this area. So that entire maneuver, that would essentially alleviate all of the threats currently suffered by the Russians that are holding out in Kucherv Yar. And we know they're still there. On September 29th, the wings of a mega drone group dropped grenades onto houses and bushes in Kucherv Yar, once and for all confirming that, yes, the Russians are still holding out over there, despite the fact that it is such a long journey to an area where there is a sense of stability and reliance on the flanks. Regardless, the Russians are still holding out, and they're largely from the 110th Brigade in Kucherv Yar itself. And it'll be far easier for them to do so if they don't have to worry about this eastern flank. And that's why the Russians are pushing all of sort of the wherewithal into this one location. And then from there, in the future, not now, there will be a massive stalwart, a really large outstretched salient, including these villages over here, meaning they will serve as forward operating posts that can be used to attack Dobropilya from the east. That's already something that I think is a a 2026 sort of initiative looking in that direction. But for the time being, it is still an important movement that has a lot of implications for the future. And the unit that is paving this, by the way, these advances, initially you had Russian forces that we've been aware of for a while over here that were doing the dirty work that I'm clicking on right now. But over the past 2 weeks, of course, the 177th Marine Brigade or Regiment, the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, and the 155th were all redeployed to this region, and they are also heavily engaged in the Russian advances that have been occurring over here in these yellow polygons in recent weeks. So certainly keep an eye on their movement in the way in which they've made a massive difference on the course of the battles. Now, over here in Siversk, we have a couple of advances to the north of Vyimka. We have this documented advance into 3.3 square kilometers. So there was a video of a Russian soldier from the 123rd Motor Rifle Regiment. They were able to push 3 kilometers west of what was previously imagined to be the Russian front line. They reached this windbreak because you have a rail line running from Vyimka all the way to southern Siversk. So in the windbreak, you have naturally a lot of Ukrainian fortified posts, including underground components. So a Russian soldier threw a TM-62 anti-tank mine into the Ukrainian fortifications, and then it detonated and caused a massive explosive yield. So that's the sort of tactic that the Russians are employing over here to simply dislodge the Ukrainians from these positions they've been heavily seeped into for 3 years now. When you look at it, they've had a lot of preparation when it comes to building up defenses over here. The problem for the Ukrainians, though, is the fact that they lack manpower in this region. The garrison defending Siversk is tight-knit, and so there's been a lot of focus on just holding out along the eastern flank of Siversk, and especially with the recent crises, the northern flank as well. So the southern one is put on the back burner. That's what led to the advance into Prizhny, and now this most recent attack north of Vyimka, which puts Vyimka in a very precarious situation because there is this new mini pocket forming that would include the fall of Vyimka were the Ukrainians to withdraw. And more generally, you have this even larger salient or larger pocket that's formed, and it spans Vyimka, it spans some dugouts that were built to the east of Prizhny, but a lot of open fields on high elevation that overlook Siversk. And so those regions are also currently in grave danger of being cut off, and that would have implications for Vyimka and for southern Siversk if nothing really comes out of the northern flank in time. But the northern flank is also very active. We have finally been able to confirm that the Russians are in control of the entire Rudnik micro-district, amounting to 1.35 square kilometers of territory. On September 30th, Russian assault squads captured all of Rudnik. They raised their flags to denote that they were able to achieve this feat. And this means that, again, there are a lot of excess open fields, a couple of tree lines and areas to the east of the Bakhmutovka River that remain to be cleared. But there is already the necessary starting point for an assault towards the actual sort of perimeter of Siversk. And then from there, begin the infiltration into the first houses, the private residential areas, the apartment complexes, the local parks, whatever it may be. So there is this concerted effort, one from the south and then also from the north, to begin closing in on the city, which, again, it's not necessarily a large city. It's not that large in surface area, but there are a lot of defensive nodes that are of note, including the apartment complexes, including the eastern outskirts, which is why the Russians avoided them in their entirety and are now bypassing it from the north and also from the south, although, to be fair, the southern flank of Siversk is very well fortified. But this sort of advance on the north, it caught the Ukrainians by surprise, and they've not necessarily, sent in the largest, most copious sort of reinforcement team to handle the situation. So for the time being, we can see how there are a lot of salients that still remain to be closed that can be used later on as the starting point for the assault directly on Siversk. So certainly keep an eye out for that situation. In Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainians may be in control of the central part of the village. There's no video footage proving otherwise, although most sources, both Russian and Ukrainian, agree in unison that this particular polygon is under Russian control. So I may change that just depending on final assessment. To the south, we have two videos here that back up the claims that the southern part of Zaporizhzhia fully fell into Russian hands, so about 2 square kilometers worth of territory taken over. The 67th Motor Rifle Division of the 25th Combined Arms Army raised their flag in southern Zaporizhzhia, and 67th Division, if you guys are unaware, includes a couple of notable units from this region that have been very active recently, including the 37th and 36th Motor Rifle Regiments. I know they're deployed over here, and then also the 31st Regiment marked in this same general area. So there's now a campaign by the Russians to just clear out the remnants of Ukraine's resistance on either end of the Zherebets River. At this point, it's becoming the western side of the Zherebets River. And from there, with this capture of much of Zaporizhzhia, there is an opportunity to advance along the paved road into Lyman itself, but there's also an opportunity to close in and advance further southwards and just dismantle any Ukrainian positions within the forested areas directly to the east of Lyman. Either sort of scenario is possible, and they're not mutually exclusive either. So Yampil, its northern flank, may be in danger as a result. Now, looking at Chandrikholove, we can see over here that the Russian side has been able to take over the southwestern corner of the village, essentially meaning that the entirety of the village has fallen into Russian hands. And this is important because, we have the video to back it up. The 144th MRD, or Division, of the 20th Combined Arms Army did raise the flag over here, and there is now an opportunity to advance towards Novoselivka and Darilove in lieu of an assault on Drobisheve, which serves as the final vanguard, the final line of defense before arriving at the perimeter of Lyman itself. So there are a lot of ways in which Novoselivka and Darilove have utility to both sides, really. Now, looking at Karpivka over here, just in the north, about 1.3 square kilometers worth of territory taken over. And we have this video over here from September 29th of the K2 Regiment. It's now, I believe, the 20th Unmanned Aerial Systems Regiment. So they were able to clear forested areas, and you could see them over here on the map. Some of these forested areas, they're really extensions of bodies of water, and so you have a lot of ravines over here. But regardless, they were able to push them back from this position over here that you see in light blue, and also they were able to take one POW during the course of the fighting. So Karpivka is still contested to a certain degree. For the most part, it's under Ukrainian control, and it's just on the eastern edge of the defense line. So it serves as a really important sticking point for the Russians. Now, to finish off with Kupyansk, you guys can see that I've not really made a definitive statement about the exact front line, and usually I do that, but over here it seems as if it wouldn't be doing it justice to mark something in one way if it was not necessarily verified. It's not coming from the most reputable sources that can back it up with video footage and such. It's just noise coming in from either side. But it is true, yes, that on both sides, when you look at their channels, both on the Russian and Ukrainian end, they are admitting that the situation in Kupyansk has deteriorated for the Ukrainians. A lot more fluid now, no more civilian movement in and out. You have the train station, and I'll mark it over here. There's a central train station in Kupyansk marked over here, and it's still under Ukrainian control nominally, but some Russian sources claim that DRGs are coming in, and there are two directions for these DRG attacks. One is from the northwest, meaning the Moskovska axis, and you can see it over here. The Moskovska axis, originated from the advances into the village, and then from there, the Russians were able to advance along the rail line and some of the nearby paved roads, and gradually just expand their footprint in the northwestern chunk of the city, meaning there's now a large gray zone because I can't, accurately depict what's going on over here. So it's simply easier to have it marked as a gray zone. It's not that controversial, but my map is far more conservative, and I'm certainly waiting out on proof, whether it be a geolocation or an admission from the Ukrainian side, about the gray zone in the city, because some would allege that you have this Uvileni district, which is over here. It's sort of like a southwestern district of Kupyansk. So some Russian sources claim that DRGs are already active over there by means of tree lines and open fields. Others claim that DRGs were able to advance along the rail line in the Kupyanka River and eventually reach the train station and are currently putting a lot of pressure on that region. There are also some claims that there's been an advance on the western bank of the Oskil River in the direction of downtown Kupyansk towards the local market and the postal service in that entire area. So again, something that cannot be verified yet, although I would say that with a huge asterisk, because it's certainly possible that even by now there may be some corroboration from the Ukrainian side or some video footage that debunks this. But for the time being, the bare minimum is that the Russians are in control of northern Kupyansk. There is a certain vector of attack along the rail line. I don't know how pronounced it is, because some Russian sources claim that they're very close to the rail line, far more than I'm depicting over here on the map, and that in the process, the Ukrainians holding out in these large apartment complexes, the Citadel as I refer to it, and some other major structures over here. There is a hospital, there may be a school, there's a pretty large church as well. So there are a couple of these larger structures. And so they're being isolated because attacking them head on is not feasible. And so expanding the horizon to the east and west, especially to the west in an area that's rather open, and you have a lot of these private residential areas with accompanying bushes and plots of land as backyards or front yards even. So those areas are easier to maneuver in compared to the sort of urban slog in the northern parts of Kupyansk. So in a way, they've been able to bypass that threat, bypass the center where you have this major salient sticking out, and have been able to sort of shift their focus to the next level, next stage of attacks in Kupyansk, which would be the downtown region, which would also include as well the central rail station and many other sort of large buildings that have that sort of important meaning to the Ukrainian defensive efforts. So, there are a lot of reports. The Ukrainians are responding urgently by sending in the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov to try to plug in those holes. That can be done on the eastern flank, where you have the sort of highway leading into downtown, or from Moskovka, where you have a direct route along the rail line to reach the station. But regardless, there are deployments now, and there are other units over here as well, although I would posit again that there has been a disregard and a lack of reinforcements for the Ukrainians in Kharkiv, not in the areas to the north necessarily, but specifically in Kupyansk. There's not been a sufficient amount of redeployments from elsewhere in order to hold out in this particular region. Now, as a result of the fall of Kupyansk, there's going to be a lot of strain on the eastern bank of the Oskil entirely, which is like 250 square kilometers worth of territory, 200 kilometers, who knows. And the area south of Kupyansk will also be in a lot of danger because it is connected naturally via the road network to Kupyansk. And because the area to the south is going to be important as a buffer, it's going to be rather large and open, meaning it's great to take over as a firing point and to acquire high ground to overlook some of the accompanying lines of villages and tree lines and such. So those areas will now be overlooked. And yeah, that gives us a pretty good understanding of what's going on in Kupyansk. I'm a bit tired. I will try to talk about it more in depth in the next video, but hopefully, you understand why I'm erring on the side of caution when it comes to reporting there. I can flip on a dime when it comes to the proof over there. So if I see even a modicum of proof to back it up, then obviously I'll change the way that I'm talking about it. But regardless of whether it's quantified on the map or not, there absolutely is a major crisis right now unfolding in Kupyansk, with the supply lines into the city getting thinner and thinner every day. The direct supply line that has been discussed a lot, that is sort of an outstretching of the line of villages in over here in Novovolodivka. So there's a road that extends out of it, and then from there arrives at the western parts of Kupyansk. Now, this is an area that, according to my map, remains under their control, but it's very feasible that recently the Russian DRGs cut it off entirely, or that the Ukrainians were pushed out, including of Sobolivka. But that would just leave this highway over here, just to the east of Hershivka, and that enters in through the southern direction. And it's why it's very important for them to retain control over Uvilini, which is an area, a micro district just in the north of the highway, in an area where DRGs apparently are active. There is also the sort of vertical highway running parallel to the Oska River. So that's another area where, the flow of supplies continues. And then maybe through some local routes, but they're not paved and they're not even dirt or gravel roads. It's just going to be something spontaneous in between these two highways, and those can be avenues for entrance and withdrawal. But yeah, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.